point of a particular product is determined. If a seller prices their product too high and he doesn't get enough buyers, then he knows to lower his price, for example, until he gets the amount of buyers that he desires to make a profit. Also, if he has a price point too low and there's so much demand for the product that he keeps selling out and there's still customers left over that want the product and are not able to obtain the product, then he will increase his price until the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. Demand is a consumer's desire to own a product, and they are willing to pay a certain price. And so when we graph this out, the demand curve shows the amount that consumers are willing and able to buy at a given price, all things equal. So individual demand is one person's demand, let's say for Starbucks. Market demand is the collective demand of individuals for a certain product. So, for example, Houston's demand for Starbucks, that would be the market demand. It's a group of individuals. So the law of demand states that, other things equal, as the price falls, the quantity demanded rises, and then vice versa. As the price rises, the quantity demanded falls. So, and this makes sense. We see this law of demand in effect in our everyday life. When the price of a good that we consume drops, we tend to buy more, and when it increases, we tend to buy less. So why does this phenomenon happen? Several reasons. First, things are not free, and so price is an obstacle to buyers. We all have a limited income, so we are not able to afford unlimited quantities of everything that we would like. Also, the law of diminishing marginal utility essentially means that when you acquire a good, each additional unit of that good gives you less and less pleasure. So, for example, I'm willing to pay $3.50 for the first cupcake. Usually, the first unit of a good is what gives consumers the most pleasure or utility. But I would not be willing to pay $3.50 for a second cupcake because I would not derive as much pleasure from a second cupcake. However, if the second cupcake were only $2, then I would buy a second cupcake, but I would not buy a second cupcake at $3.50. So the price has to go down in order for me to consume more and more cupcakes. Also, there's the income effect. My income may not change, but if the price of my groceries and gas keeps on increasing, then I feel less wealthy, and therefore I consume less of those goods. I might ride my bike more. I might stick to produce that's only in season, since it tends to be cheaper in season, etc. And also we have the substitution effect. So for me, I like Coke and I like Dr. Pepper. And so if Coke keeps on rising in price, then I'm going to consume less Coke, which is in line with the law of demand, and instead consume more Dr. Pepper, since Dr. Pepper now is relatively cheaper to Coke. Okay, so on the left we have the demand schedule. So this is an individual's demand for corn. So at $5, I would buy 10 bushels a week. At $4, I would buy 20 bushels. At 3, I would buy 35 bushels. At 2, I would buy 55 bushels. And at 1, I would buy 80 bushels. So this is in line with what we see the law of demand. As the price of corn per bushel rises, I demand less and less bushels, and vice versa. As the price of corn per bushel drops, I buy more and more bushels of corn. So if we were to graph this out, so price will always be on the vertical axis on supply and demand graphs, and quantity will always be on the horizontal axis here. Okay, so to graph this out, we see here at $5 per bushel, I demand, 10 bushels of corn. Or I can buy them too, same thing. All right. So this is the first point. At $4 a bushel, I demand 20 bushels of corn. So we have 4 over here, that's the price. We go to 20 here, we make the second point. At $3, demand 35. And so on. At $2, I demand 55. And I'm sorry, this graph is a little off over here. This should be 0, 1, 2, 3, and then this catches up 4, 5, 6. Okay, and at 1, I demand 80 bushels of corn. Okay, so I have my points, and then I connect them with a line. And here we have the demand curve, which is downward sloping. It's downward sloping because of the law of demand. As prices rise, okay, quantity demanded falls, and then vice versa. As prices fall, quantity demanded rises. Okay, it shows the inverse relationship between price and quantity. Okay, so the market demand, let's say the market for corn is 3 buyers, Joe, Jen, and Jay. So you would add up their individual demand curves to get their total quantity demanded, and that's your market demand. So at $5 per bushel, okay, Joe demands 10 bushels, Jen 12, Jay 8. Okay, so we would add all this up, and we get at $5 a bushel, the market demands 30 bushels a week. At $4, Joe demands 20, Jen demands 23, Jay demands 17, and so the market demand would be 60 bushels total per week. And so you would graph this out just like we did in the last example. So except we would do on the horizontal axis, we would be graphing out total quantity demanded per week. Okay, so let's say the market demand for corn here is graphed out, and this is for 200 buyers. So at $5, the market demands 2,000 bushels of corn. At $4, 4,000, 3, 7,000, so on. Okay, what I want to graph out here are changes in demand. Okay, so if there were an event to cause an increase in demand, then the demand curve would shift to the right. Okay, and if there was anything that would cause demand to decrease, the demand curve would shift to the left. Okay, and we have D3 over here. So right is more, left is less. And so what we notice here is that when there's a shift in the demand curve, then quantity demanded has changed at every price. So for example, before, at $5 we were at 2,000 bushels of corn demanded, but when there was an increase in demand, okay, and went up to almost 6,000 bushels of corn, and at $4 there was 4,000 bushels of corn demanded, and there was an increase in demand. Now it's almost 8,000 bushels of corn demanded, etc. So quantity demanded changes at every price when there's a shift in demand. Okay, so if there's an increase in demand, then quantity demanded increases at every price, and if there's a decrease in demand, shifts to the left, then quantity demanded decreases at every price. Let's talk about the difference between a change in demand and a change in quantity demanded. Okay, the terminology is very important here, because when we say there's been a change in demand, that means there's been a shift in demand. So, there's either been an increase in demand or a decrease in demand. When we say there's a change in quantity demanded, that means there's been a movement along the demand curve. And so what causes this to happen is a change in price. Okay, so if we go from $4 to $3, we see here that quantity demanded has changed. Okay, but we are still on the same curve. So what causes a change in quantity demanded is a change in the price of the good. And then there are other factors that cause a change in demand. That's a shift. But the one thing I want you to keep in mind is that a change in the price of the good in question that we are talking about, so in this case is corn, will not cause a shift in demand. Okay, it will only cause a movement along the demand curve. Okay, so price of the good in question changing does not shift the demand curve for that good. It only causes a change in movement. Okay, let's talk about what does shift the demand curve. Okay, a change in consumer tastes and preferences. Okay, so let's do an example here. This is the price and quantity of Walkmans. So believe it or not, you can still find like a CD Walkman out there. Okay, but overall, at every price point, people demand less and less Walkmans. Now they're using their phone or they're using iPods or other portable MP3 players. So the demand overall has shifted to the left. People demand less CD Walkmans now at every price point than they did before. Alright. Also change in the number of buyers. So as more and more people move to Houston, we have an increase in the demand for flip-flops. Okay, so okay, price of flip-flops, quantity of flip-flops. Okay, and the original demand curve for flip-flops. Okay, and now as more and more people move to Houston, there's an increase in demand for flip-flops at every price. Okay. Okay. Change in income is the third determinant of demand. As a consumer's income rises, they buy more normal goods and less inferior goods, and then vice versa. If a consumer were to experience a loss in income, then they buy less normal goods and more inferior goods. So what determines a normal good, or what distinguishes a normal good from an inferior good, is what happens to your quantity demanded of that good when your income changes. So if your income goes up and you buy more of that good, then it's a normal good. Likewise, if your income goes up and you buy less of that good, then it's an inferior good. So for example, usually generic brands are considered inferior goods. All right, so let's do a couple of examples. All right, so I have mac and cheese, Kraft, mac and cheese. See, I can fit it here. Okay. Okay, for me, that's a normal good. Okay, as my income goes up, I will demand more and more mac and cheese at every price point. Okay, so before I demanded at price 2, I demanded a certain quantity, and now I demand a higher quantity because I can simply afford more. Okay. Now, if I were to lose my job, then I would decrease my demand for Kraft mac and cheese. Okay. And buy more generic mac and cheese. Okay, just keeping it simple here. Okay. So my income goes down, then I buy less of the name brand mac and cheese and more of the generic mac and cheese. Okay. But if I were to find another job, then I would buy less generic mac and cheese and more name brand mac and cheese. Okay. The fourth determinant of demand is change in the price of related goods. And so we will look at complementary goods and substitute goods. Okay. So we will go with the example I had earlier with Coke and Dr. Pepper. For me, I consider these substitutes because I can have one or the other. I don't consume both of them together. Whereas with complementary goods, usually these are goods you consume together. So for example, coffee and milk, cereal milk, peanut butter and jelly, etc. Okay. So what will happen to the demand for Dr. Pepper if the price of Coke increases? Okay, so since I consider these substitutes, I can have one or the other. If the price of Coke increases, then I will buy less Coke and demand more Dr. Pepper. Okay. Notice here on the graph for Coke, notice that there was just a movement along the demand curve and not a shift. Why? Because price of Coke increased. Okay, and the price of the good in question changing does not cause the demand curve of that good to shift. I didn't say the price of Dr. Pepper shift. I just said at P1 I would demand more Dr. Pepper because now Coke is more expensive. So just a friendly reminder there. Another thing with substitute goods is that if the price of good A rises, then the demand of good B will increase. And if the price of good A drops, then the demand of good B will also drop. So with complementary goods, they have the opposite relationship. If the price of good A rises, then the demand for good B drops and vice versa. So let's do coffee and milk. I don't really drink milk unless it's with my coffee. Okay. Okay, so milk, coffee, demand for coffee, demand for milk. Okay, so if the price of coffee rises, then I will consume a lower quantity of coffee Okay, remember, since the price of coffee changed, there wasn't a shift, just a movement. And since I'm drinking less coffee, then I am going to drink less milk, so demand for milk shifts to the left. So the price of milk, for example, may not have changed, but I will consume less milk just because I'm also consuming less coffee. All right, and the last determinant of demand is change in consumer expectations. If you expect a certain good to increase in price in the future, then you might buy more of that good today. Also, if there were reports, that a hurricane is expected to hit Houston, then you might demand more bottled waters, generator, etc. And also income. If you expect your future income to keep on increasing, then you may be willing to buy more goods now in expectation that you'll be making more money in the future. Here's some other examples that can shift the demand curve. This will be a great time for you to take out, pen and paper and draw out graphs and emulate what you see here in graph form. So, for example, physical fitness rises in popularity, increasing the demand for jogging shoes and bicycles. Cell phone popularity rises, reducing the demand for landline phones. So this will be a great time to, graph out a demand curve for jogging shoes and bicycles, and show how it shifts to the right, and then also draw out a demand curve for landline phones and show how the popularity of the cell phone has shifted the demand for landline phones to the left. So I recommend pausing this slide and graphing out what happens to the demand curve with each of these scenarios. Supply is the amount of a good that a producer can provide. So a supply curve on a graph will show the amount producers are willing and able to sell at given price points. So similar with demand, individual supply is how much one producer is willing to supply at each price point. A market supply is how much a group of producers are willing to supply collectively at each price point. The law of supply states that other things equal, as the price rises, the quantity supplied rises, and as the price falls, the quantity supplied falls. So there's a positive relationship between the price and quantity. One reason for this is that as a producer produces more goods, a lot of times their costs will increase. They have to hire more people, or they may need to expand their space, etc. And so they're only able and willing to supply more if they can earn a higher price. And also, they're also willing to supply more at higher prices as well, because they can also earn a higher profit. The supply curve slopes upward because there's a positive relationship between price and quantity for the supplier. So, at $1 per bushel, then the farmer is only willing to supply 5 bushels of corn per week. At $2, they could cover more of their costs plus maybe earn more of a profit, and so they're willing to supply 20 bushels per week. At $3, they're willing to supply 35 bushels. At $4.50 and at $5, they'll supply 60 bushels of corn. And so we connect these dots and we get our supply curve. Okay, and so very similar to demand, an increase in supply, will cause a shift to the right of the supply curve, and a decrease in supply will cause the supply curve to shift to the left. And just a friendly reminder, the price of the good in question changing would not cause the supply curve of that good to shift. It would only cause a movement along the curve. Okay. And so showing here, we're going to talk about the determinants of supply, and if one of the determinants of supply changes, then that will cause a shift in supply. However, if the price were to change, then it would only cause a movement along the supply curve, not a shift. Okay, so what would cause the supply curve to shift? It would be a change in resource prices. Resources are what is used to make the final product. So it could be, for example, labor is a resource. So, if labor costs increase, then, at a certain price point, it costs more money for so producers to provide that product now, and so they usually produce less units of that product than before. But also, let's say, for example, Starbucks, another resource price for them will be the cost of coffee beans. Let's say the cost of coffee beans were to drop, then they are able to produce more coffee at certain price points than before, since it's more profitable now. A change in technology usually always causes a supply curve to shift to the right. Usually it allows producers to produce more units of that good at a lower cost. And so they're able to supply more at each given price point. A change in the number of sellers is pretty straightforward. An increase in the number of sellers would increase the total supply of a certain good. So, for example, if more coffee shops open up in Houston, then there would be a larger supply of lattes at each price point than before. And also, if sellers were to leave the coffee market, then there would be less lattes supplied at each price point. So supply of lattes would decrease and the supply curve would shift to the left. Any change in taxes and subsidies would also shift the supply curve. A tax cut increases supply because now, taxes are part of their operating costs, and since their operating costs went down, they're able to provide more units of a good at each given price point than before. An increase in taxes would shift supply to the left since their costs have increased. Also, any type of government subsidies. So, when farmers get government subsidies that help offset their operating costs, then farmers are able to produce more at each given price point than before. And if a subsidy were to be revoked, then that would shift supply to the left. Okay. Also, a change in prices of other goods can shift the supply curve. So, let's say farmer has a fixed amount of land and he grows wheat and corn, and let's say the price of wheat drops, so it's not as profitable to grow wheat. So instead, they decide to grow more corn. So the supply curve for wheat shifts to the left, and the supply curve for corn shifts to the right. And also a change in producer expectations. If a producer expects for the demand of the product to go up in the future, then they may supply more now, so that they make sure that they have enough stock. And also vice versa, if they expect the demand for their product to go down, they may decrease supply now so that there will not be inventory left over. Okay. Let's work through a couple of examples here. So, a change in resource prices. Okay, decrease in the price of microchips increases the supply of computers. Okay, so this is supply and demand of computers. Okay, so microchips are considered an input. They are part of a computer. And so since, one of the parts to make a computer is now cheaper, a producer is able to supply more computers profitably at each given price, so supply would shift to the right. And so at each given price, they would supply more computers than before. Okay. Let's do changes in subsidies. So a decline in subsidies to state universities reduces the supply of higher education. Okay, so subsidies can help offset the cost of tuition for students. And so if the subsidies were to be taken away or reduced, then less students will be demanding higher education, and so the supply of higher education decreases. Okay, so now we're going to put supply and demand together on the same graph, and where they intersect is what we call market equilibrium. Okay, and equilibrium price is the price point at which quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, and equilibrium quantity is the quantity demanded and quantity supplied at the equilibrium price. And we consider market equilibrium the most efficient allocation, where we don't have any surpluses or any shortages. The people that value the goods the most are the people that get the goods, and the firms that can most profitably provide the goods are the ones who provide the goods. If we are not at equilibrium, then we usually have either a surplus of goods or a shortage of goods. Okay, as mentioned in the last slide, when we are at market equilibrium, society is at its most efficient allocation. So productive efficiency, the firms that are able to produce the goods in the least costly way are the ones that are producing the goods. They are using the best technology in order to minimize the costs, and they're using the right mix of resources to be able to provide these goods in the least costly way possible for consumers. Allocative efficiency means that firms are producing the right mix of goods. What exactly is that? So it's the goods that are most highly valued by society. Going back to our earlier example with MP3 players versus CD Walkmans, society values portable MP3